My final point now that I want to get into is the idea of collaborations and hybrid knowledge. So we've talked about conflict, really, between indigenous and settler forms of knowing the land. We've talked about collaborations or we've talked about co-management and consultation as these sort of very formal processes by which indigenous knowledge is or isn't, and that's the debate, right, taken into federal and other kinds of environmental programs. Now I want to think a little bit more about it from the grassroots level, about the ways in which people share knowledge and knowledge transforms between people at the ground roots. And I want to introduce a concept now of hybrid knowledge. Hybrid knowledge we might think of as knowledge systems that are blending together and making something unique and contingent and novel. That not to say the blending metaphor, though, might not be great because the other knowledge systems still exist, but suggesting that there comes to be entanglements, assemblages, mixing togethers of knowledge in the lives of the people actually doing something with that knowledge. Or to put it more simply, knowledge systems need not be thought of as a binary, right? So we talk about indigenous knowledge and we talk about Western knowledge, and we oftentimes treat those as foils. So Davy and Quilly talk about sort of Western ways of knowing the environment as, quote, individualized, rationalized, and disenchanted ontology. And not to criticize their scholarship, which I'm sure is good and fine and great, but you can find, hundreds of different, if you go online or if you look through academic books and articles or the writings of Joe anybody on the internet, you can find hundreds, thousands of different people saying, Western ways of viewing the environment are more resource oriented, are more individualistic, are less relational. Indigenous systems are more relational, are more holistic, and kind of drawing this sharp binary. And I don't want to deny that in many cases that binary represents a great degree of truth, that the ways that outsiders and local people are seeing the environment are fundamentally and sometimes irreconcilably different. But I also want, and indeed people that have studied this a great deal, such as Figure Birks, have noted that, right? Scientific ecological knowledge is different. TK is moral as opposed to supposedly value-free. TK is spiritual as opposed to mechanistic, right? And I don't want to downplay these historical differences between indigenous ways of knowing the land and sort of the ways of knowing the land that grew out of the European Enlightenment. But I do want to suggest, this is actually a quote from Arun Agrawal. I should really have it in quotes. That's some professor is breaking one of his own cardinal rules there. Thank you, Professor Agrawal. I want to make the point that although these knowledge systems can be distinguished historically, we also have to acknowledge the historic reality that nobody's worldview is some sort of, or very few people's worldviews are static objects that haven't been affected by any culture other than their own. As Agrawal suggests, quote, in the face of evidence that suggests contact, variation, transformation, exchange, communication, and learning over the last several centuries, it's difficult to adhere to a view of indigenous and Western forms of knowledge being untouched by each other. Or to put it differently, people listen to each other and are influenced by each other, right? Our knowledge of environment is, as Cruikshanks says, continually produced in the context of encounters. What does that mean? Among other things, that means that our different worldviews, our views of the environment over time have been profoundly shaped as different cultural traditions have come together. Again, hybrid knowledge. And we see that really provocatively and really profoundly, I think, in environmentalism, and especially as indigenous peoples collaborate with other environmental organizers. I say other environmental organizers because I want to stress that I don't see indigenous peoples and environmentalism as an environmentalist as a binary. Indeed, many environmental organizations are staffed by many native people, and so I don't want to suggest that it's a binary, but I do want to suggest that to the degree that you sometimes have sort of outsider environmentalists or environmental organizations that then are collaborating with the people native to the land, that oftentimes that can cause all sorts of outcomes, some of which are hybrid knowledge, are these kinds of mixing of knowledge and this sort of people listening and sharing ideas and crafting new forms of discourse. At the same time, I want to point out that that doesn't always go that way. It can sometimes be a lot more problematic. So there's a number of scholars who have studied environmentalist campaigns alongside indigenous peoples and noted where they can be problematic or challenging. There's a famous 1995 paper. Whenever I say famous, you should read that as anthropology famous. So 10 people read it instead of 5. just joking. Thousands as opposed to 10. Anyways, there's a classic article called The Shifting Middle Ground, where it talks about Yanomami and outsider environmentalist groups that were cooperating on an effort to halt gold mining in Yanomami territory. One of the points they pointed out that Beth Conklin and Graham made in this article, this well-known article, is that Yanomami people and their environmentalist allies had very different ideas about the landscape, including the environmentalists kind of viewing it more as something that needed to be fenced off and just protected, and protected meaning protected from any sort of human involvement, and Yanomami people seeing it more as, well, we should be able to develop resources and have an economic presence in this land. We just want to make sure we have a say in it and that it's done the right way, and that certain lands are definitely protected from destructive gold mining. So two different ways of viewing the land, and that oftentimes people were engaging in sort of a shifting middle ground or an almost like deceptive activity where that neither side was being fully transparent about their goals for the purpose of being able to ally on this project, and instead sort of leaving things unsaid for the sake of building an alliance, a temporary alliance. And indeed, that's a pattern we've seen replicated many times over, where the relationship between indigenous communities and outsider environmentalist communities have been temporary, fragmentary, only along certain lines, maybe end after a while, or maybe proceed for a long time, but sometimes have goals that ultimately, if would be conflicting if either side fully got their way, but they're willing to ally against a sort of common threat, right? I want to suggest, though, that so that's an important kind of trend that we have to note. It's not the only kind of trend that can happen, though. Again, this idea of hybrid environmentalism, where groups actually are listening deeply to each other, partly because they're collaborating from the ground up. I've seen that a lot in my own research, right? When I look at the movement that I studied, you see examples of people holding up signs or making speeches that lean heavily into indigenous cosmologies about these spaces, protect our sacred, and then the Navajo names for each of these holy mountains, including the Goastheid. And you also have time, and indeed there are let's say about half of the people that have been involved in some of these organizing efforts have been Native people. Not just Navajo, many other groups as well. You also have a lot of people who are not Native that have been involved, and sometimes you see signs or different things or websites that have been created that really heavily lean into sort of this particular U.S. Sort of lab scientific / post-1960s environmentalist way of talking about environmental pollution as toxicity and, the lab coats and things like that, and danger, health threat. But a lot of times what you see is some kind of blending of the two. So for example, the common refrain, respect native cultures, defend our environment, protect public health, right? This idea that, yes, you're sort of recognizing and acknowledging that there's different kinds of concerns that have brought people into the movement, but you're also acknowledging that they're fundamentally intertwined, that all three of these things go together when opposing the expansion of this ski resort. And indeed, other discourses put it even a little more sharply than that. You have, it talks about the snow has been proven to contain harmful contaminants like pharmaceuticals, hormones, and cancer-causing agents. They would use 1.5 million gallons per day, spraying this wastewater on a mountain that is also holy to more than 13 indigenous nations. At a speech I was at one time, the person giving this speech talked about, this water, and he held up a water bottle full of reclaimed wastewater the kind of water that they use to make the snow in this case, and he said, do you think the mayor would drink this? Do you think council would drink this? And no, not if they want to have children, right? So he was alluding to a scientific study that had been done out of the labs at a nearby university showing that the wastewater could have endocrine disrupting effects on amphibian populations and fish populations. So it's very much this sort of, to use Kimmerer's terminology again, sort of this very like settler ecology, like scientific ecology sort of way of framing it. But then right after that, he said, then why is it good enough to put on our holy mountain, right? So a true blending of both spiritual and scientific, if we want to draw that distinction, ways of speaking about the space. To the point where you wonder if it even makes sense to distinguish the two at some point when people have so thoroughly blended both into their ways of speaking about the space. I asked somebody one time, is it more the environmental or the cultural concerns for you? Which was a stupid question, but I'm grateful for kind people that respond graciously to stupid questions. And this particular man, he responded, for me, they're one and the same. For me as an indigenous person, the environmental concerns are the cultural concerns. And I think, hybrid knowledge in this way can mount a profound moral critique of contemporary eco-hegemony. What I mean by that, we started this semester talking about the idea of dominant ideas about the environment. And as indigenous and settler ideas blend together, sometimes they can really profoundly speak against that. So for example, you have non-native people associated with these movements that are, and as well as native people, that are speaking in the language of, okay, let's talk about the pollutants, let's talk about what the studies have said, but let's reject the idea that just because we can measure a pollutant with a scientific study, that's the only kind of pollution. So they'll talk about that, but they'll also talk about, well, here's some of the contamination that our medicine people have told us about, right? So rejecting the idea that science alone can tell us about what's going on with the landscape, while at the same time acknowledging what it can tell us about a landscape, which fundamentally and implicitly is rejecting the concept that Western people are the only ones with something meaningful to say about that space. Or using the language of pollutants and laws and NEPA and all of these things, but also citing indigenous people and saying, you cannot divide spirituality into little pieces, as one protester said. The entire mountain is sacred, or as one woman told me in an interview, it's like a living being. So this blending, or that the mountain cannot be, since it's thought of as a being, as one man said, you can't say, oh, I'm only going to affect part of it, only put this drug on part of you. Instead, that affects the whole thing because it's a body, right? So the idea of land as a body is fundamentally different than the idea of land as sort of something you can divide up like a pie and give to multiple uses. So it really critiques the way we tend to think about land a lot of times and how we manage, quote unquote, land. What? Sorry, my family just came home. So let me finish up this video by saying, so sometimes the relationships between environmentalist groups and indigenous groups can instead be less of a binary or two groups sort of collaborating temporarily for an alliance and more of a grassroots sort of fusion and entanglement. And I think that's where things get really interesting. But I'm also a little biased since it was my dissertation topic. But it's also, I want to stress, not just something we see with the one campaign I studied, but many, many environmental campaigns, from Dakota Access Pipeline to Mauna Kea, to countless other indigenous sorts of movements. So we need to think of knowledge in these complex ways, I think. Final note I want to acknowledge, though, is that sometimes relationships between environmentalist groups and indigenous people can be anything but collaborative. The Macaw whaling controversy in the Pacific Northwest in the 90s was a great example, where some outsider groups opposed to Macaw people starting to do a very limited hunting of whales made sometimes extremely strong statements about Macaw whale hunting, attempted to stop Macaw whale hunting, even occasionally said things that were quite racist about Macaw whales, or about Macaw people whaling. And there was a lot of assumptions going into that. We'll talk about some of those assumptions next week. This is kind of a transition into talking about that. So we'll talk then. But thank goodness that a lot of times it's not that, and it's instead something better and richer. It's important that, quote, we take seriously indigenous knowledge and how, quote, we care for the land. It's also important that we question what we even mean by we and who's being included or excluded in that kind of a framing, so that we can come, I think, to a space where many different perspectives are being taken when we manage the land, or when we care for the land. Manage already kind of implies a certain worldview when we relate to the land, because ultimately the environmental and economic issues that we face are mighty and significant, and they're going to require more than one viewpoint to solve. Thank you.